New Testament scholar Thomas Schreiner wrote, "If one were inclined to doubt the authenticity of any letter in the New Testament, it would be 2 Peter. Practically all liberal scholars agree that the Apostle Peter did not actually write 2 Peter, and even a good bunch of Bible-believing conservative scholars think this way. The letter begins with the author identifying himself as Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. So, if Peter isn't the author, then what's going on here? Is the Bible lying to us?" I did the homework and looked at the arguments from both sides. We're going to look at why people doubt the authorship of 2 Peter, whether their doubts are reasonable, and if so, should Christians be concerned? Historically, most Christians have believed that 2 Peter was written by Peter. As I said, the author identifies himself as Peter. The letter includes some personal notes about things happening in his life, which would be weird if it wasn't actually Peter. But just as most Christians throughout history believed Peter wrote this letter, we also find that, historically, most Christian thinkers had concerns about 2 Peter. In fact, many of them did doubt that 2 Peter actually was written by Peter. If you open up 1 and 2 Peter today, you will find that the style of writing is quite different. The vocabulary is different. It doesn't sound like the same person wrote those two letters. The first letter is kind of casual. It's what you would expect from a Galilean fisherman like Peter. The second letter is complex, dense, wordy, elaborate. It's what you would expect from someone formally educated. Modern scholars have also pointed out that 2 Peter seems to deal with issues happening in the 2nd century church after Peter died. The author of 2 Peter sees Paul's writings as scripture, which, again, people argue that this belief didn't exist until after Peter died. All this comes together to make a pretty compelling argument that 2 Peter was not written by Peter. It was written after Peter died, but it uses Peter's name to address challenges happening later in church history. We've seen this thinking show up in some of my previous videos, once when I discussed the author of Ephesians, and again in my 2 videos on the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. In each case, my response has been pretty consistent with scholars who are more conservative. First, the difference in styles do not necessarily mean differences in author. They could also mean differences in the audience being addressed, differences in the issues being brought up. A good communicator is able to mix it up. Second, remember from our previous videos that biblical authors may have used secretaries to write for them, called amanuenses. That could very well explain differences too. Third, it just seems so unrealistic to think that we can confidently predict authors based on how they wrote in the past. People are dynamic, changing, learning, growing human beings. We write differently even when we are in different emotional states. So I'll grant that 2 Peter doesn't sound like your average Galilean fisherman, but let's not fall into stereotypes. Even still, Thomas Schreiner did well when he said this: "We must remind ourselves that we should conceive of Peter as a businessman who engaged in physical labor and commerce. When we add to this the fact that Galilee was influenced by Hellenism and Greek culture, it is not astonishing that he would be familiar with Greek philosophical terms. The terms he used would not require a thorough study of Greek philosophy or classics, nor did Peter use the terms in a technical sense. Indeed, Peter likely used Hellenistic terms to speak to the culture of his day." As for the fact that 2 Peter appears to be talking about concerns that only existed after the time of Peter, the general response you'll get is that there are a lot of shaky assumptions holding up the argument. Like, for example, 2 Peter gives encouragement to people who are frustrated that Jesus hasn't returned yet. This was a concern in the 2nd century, to be sure, but why assume this wasn't a concern near the end of Peter's life? Even Paul talks about end-time concerns in 1 Thessalonians, and it's easy to imagine these concerns starting to bubble up near the end of Peter's life. Another example, 2 Peter calls Paul's writings scripture, which is said to be a 2nd century belief. But as Carson and Moo point out, the apostles considered their own words to carry an authority tantamount to Scripture. They thought of themselves as inspired by the same Spirit who inspired the prophets. They expected their letters to be read in the church along with the Old Testament. So is it really unusual that actual Peter would refer to Paul's writings as scripture? At this point, you may wonder if my arguments are enough to affirm Peter wrote 2 Peter. I think they are, but what if they're not? Is that a problem for Christianity? Well, Richard Bauckham is a conservative scholar who would say no. In his scholarship, he brought to the table a really significant conversation. Bauckham argues that 2 Peter is written in a style or genre known as testament. Apparently, it was a common Jewish custom to write as if you were someone else near the end of their life, giving a final charge to the next generation. Everyone knew that these testament writings were not actually written by the person. It was just a cultural thing. Bauckham compares 2 Peter with these testament writings and argues that it's basically another one of those. He calls it transparent fiction, a literary convention that the author expected his readers to recognize as such. So if Bauckham is right, the author of 2 Peter isn't trying to deceive. He is simply drawing from Peter's apostolic message and authority and applying it to the next generation, using Peter's name, but expecting his readers to understand it isn't actually Peter. If Bauckham is right, then 2 Peter isn't lying to us when it opens up with the words, Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. This is why I think conservative Christian scholars have felt more freedom to accept or deny whether Paul wrote 2 Peter. It's also why I think Christianity isn't dead in the water if it's somehow proven without a doubt that Peter never wrote 2 Peter. But keep in mind that some people have challenged the Testament view by Bauckham and others. Personally, I think they offer some good and strong challenges, but I also respect Bauckham as a scholar, and I'll leave the rest of this conversation to your judgment. Hope that helps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.